Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are jumping into a period that really changes everything, the early modern world, from about 1450 to 1750.
It's the moment where the oceans stop being these huge barriers.
Exactly, and they become highways. All of a sudden, they're connecting merchants, empires, and ideas in a way that had never, ever happened before.
It's the real start of global history, not just regional history. You go from having separate networks like the Silk Road or the Indian Ocean to one single interconnected planet.
And our mission today is to unpack that, to really get into the specific mix of technology, competition, and just pure economic pressure that pushed a few European states to launch this whole new system.
We can really boil it down to three huge shifts. The big three you need to keep in your head.
Okay, what's number one?
First, you have European states, we're talking Portugal, Spain, and then the Dutch and English hot on their heels, launching these sustained transoceanic voyages.
And number two, which is just mind-blowing, is the first permanent sustained contact between the Eastern and Western hemispheres, between Afro-Eurasia and the Americas.
And that contact leads to the third and maybe the most consequential shift, the rise of brand new economic systems. We're talking about mercantilism and, tragically, the huge expansion of plantation-based slavery.
But before we get to the ships and the voyages, we have to do a quick context check, because in 1450, Europe was not the world power.
Oh, not at all. That's a classic mistake, looking backward. If you were a betting person in 1450, you would not have put your money on Europe.
Who would you bet on?
Well, you'd look at Ming China, which was this incredibly powerful, centralized state, or the Ottoman Empire, which was just expanding like crazy. Europe was small, it was fragmented, and it was kind of playing catch-up.
So its big advantage wasn't strength, it was geography and all that infighting?
Exactly. Its position on the Atlantic and the fact that all those little kingdoms were constantly competing with each other, that turned out to be a surprising strength.
Okay, so let's paint that picture. What did this multi-centered world actually look like around 1450?
Well, over in East Asia, you've got the Ming dynasty. They'd kicked out the Mongols and were really focused inward restoring traditions, rebuilding the Great Wall, the Grand Canal. They were the absolute center of gravity in Asia.
And in the Middle East, the great land empires were on the move.
Absolutely. The Ottomans are the ones to watch. We're in 1450, remember. In just 3 years, they're going to take Constantinople.
1453. A huge moment.
A huge moment. It basically gives them control over the crossroads of Europe and Asia. That really changes the economic game for everyone.
And what about Africa? It wasn't just on the sidelines.
No, it was central to the whole Afro-Eurasian economy. In West Africa, empires like Mali and later Songhai controlled the trans-Saharan gold trade. That gold flowed all through the system.
And on the other side of the continent.
You had the Swahili city-states, Kilwa, Mombasa, that were these vibrant trading hubs, deeply connected to the Indian Ocean network, trading with India, Arabia, you name it.
And then, completely cut off from all of this, you have the Americas.
Completely. I mean, you have these incredible empires like the Aztec and the Inca, but they are on a totally separate track of development. Different crops, different animals, different diseases. They aren't in the loop at all.
So that's the world.
Yeah.
Which brings us back to the big question. Why was it small, fragmented Europe that made the leap? It's more than just God, gold, and glory.
It is. I mean, those are the headlines. But the real driver was economic pressure. For centuries, Europeans loved Asian luxury, goods, spices, silk.
But they were incredibly expensive.
Incredibly, because they had to come overland or through intermediaries like Venice, who took a huge cut. And then, when the Ottomans consolidate power, that route becomes even more precarious.
So it's not just about getting cheaper pepper. It's a strategic problem.
It's a strategic threat. The perception was that the Ottomans could choke off that trade entirely. So rulers had this massive incentive: find a sea route, go around them. If you can do that, you can get rich and cut your rivals out of the picture.
And this desire for wealth, it's not just greed. It's tied to a whole new economic theory.
Right.
Mercantilism.
Yes. We should define that. Mercantilism is basically the idea that there's a fixed amount of wealth in the world, a pie of a certain size, mostly in gold and silver.
So your goal as a state is to get the biggest slice of the pie possible.
Exactly. You want to export more than you import, you want to hoard bullion, and you want colonies to provide you with raw materials and buy your finished goods. It's economic warfare, really.
This is where that political fragmentation you mentioned comes in, the glory part.
That's the key. Unlike, say, the unified Ming Empire, which could just decide to stop its voyages, Europe was a mess of rivals. If Portugal found a new trade route,
Then Spain had to find one too, and France and England had to get in on the action.
it created this relentless pressure to innovate and take massive risks. A king might bankrupt his country funding a crazy voyage because the payoff, all that gold and silver, could make him the most powerful monarch in Europe overnight.
And God was the justification for it all.
It was the perfect moral and cultural framework, spreading Christianity, finding mythical Christian allies. It gave a higher purpose to what was at its core a ruthless economic and political competition.
But you can't do any of this without the right gear. Let's talk about the tech. The big innovation was the ship, right? The caravel.
The caravel was a game changer. It was small, it was maneuverable, and critically, it combined two different types of sails.
They had the big square sails for power.
Right, for when the wind is at your back.
Yeah.
But it also had triangular lateen sails, which it borrowed from sailors in the Indian Ocean.
And the lateen sail let you do what exactly?
It lets you tack or sail against the wind. It gives you incredible flexibility. You're no longer totally at the mercy of the seasonal winds. You can explore a complex coastline. You can get home when the winds aren't in your favor. It's essential.
And then there are the instruments they used for navigation.
And again, it's all about borrowing and adapting. They're using the magnetic compass, which comes from China. They're using the astrolabe to figure out their latitude, which has Greek and Islamic roots.
So here's the real aha moment for you. European success wasn't about inventing everything from scratch.
Not at all. It was about being brilliant synthesizers. They took existing technologies from all over the world and applied them with this incredible competitive focus to one problem: mastering the oceans.
So let's look at the first two to really put this toolkit into action. Portugal and Spain. They build two very different kinds of empires.
Totally different. Portugal looks east towards the Indian Ocean. Prince Henry the Navigator sponsors these very methodical voyages down the coast of Africa.
They're just inching their way down, mapping as they go.
Systematically. And then, boom, Bartolome Dias rounds the Cape of Good Hope in 1488. And about 10 years later, Vasco da Gama makes it all the way to India.
They've cracked it. The sea route to the spices is open.
And their strategy is what we call a trading post empire. They're not trying to conquer huge amounts of land. They use their ships, which are basically floating cannon platforms, to seize control of key ports.
Like choke points.
Exactly. Places like Goa in India or Malacca in Southeast Asia. They muscle their way in, build a fort, and force everyone to pay them for the right to trade. It's a maritime protection racket, basically.
So while Portugal is setting up this network in the east, Spain makes this wild gamble to go west.
The westward gamble. Christopher Columbus convinces Ferdinand and Isabella to fund his trip in 1492. He thought the world was much smaller, and he bumps right into the Americas by mistake.
And Spain's model is not trade posts, it's conquest.
It quickly becomes conquest and colonization. I mean, the speed with which small groups of conquistadors, Cortez against the Aztec, Pizarro against the Inca, topple these massive empires is staggering.
They have steel weapons, they have horses.
Sure, but those are advantages, not the deciding factor. The real weapons were, first, their ability to make alliances with local groups who hated the ruling empires, and second, and most devastatingly, disease. Smallpox, measles, influenza, these were diseases the indigenous populations had zero immunity to. The death tolls are almost unimaginable, sometimes 90% or more of the population wiped out. It was an unintentional biological catastrophe.
And once they've conquered these lands, Spain needs a way to extract wealth. They set up the encomienda system.
Right, which basically gave a Spanish settler the right to demand forced labor and tribute from a native community. It was a brutal system of exploitation.
But as the native populations died off from disease and overwork, that system started to fail. There wasn't enough labor.
And that's the moment that fuels the massive expansion of the transatlantic slave trade. They need a new labor force, one they believed was more resistant to disease, to work the mines and the sugar plantations.
So they begin importing enslaved Africans in horrifying numbers. This becomes the engine of the colonial economy.
It does. And the primary product of all this brutal labor was silver, American silver.
From mines like Potosi in Bolivia.
Potosi was a mountain made of silver. It, along with mines in Mexico, produced wealth on a scale the world had never seen. And that silver is what truly connects the entire globe.
How so? I mean, goes to Spain, obviously.
It goes to Spain, yes, and funds their empire. But a huge chunk of it doesn't stop there. It gets loaded onto galleons in Mexico, sails across the Pacific to the Philippines.
Like across the Pacific. Why?
To get to China. Because China's massive economy ran on silver. They needed it for taxes, for commerce, and for the first time, Europeans had something China actually wanted.
So American silver, mined by African and indigenous labor, is being used to buy Chinese silk and porcelain.
Exactly. That silver becomes the first truly global currency. It links the economies of the Americas, Europe, and Asia into a single functioning network for the first time in history.
So bringing it all together, what we're seeing is the Great Merger, the end of separate regional systems and the beginning of one global one.
It's a complete rewiring. You have goods, plants, and animals moving in all directions, the Columbian Exchange. Potatoes and corn from the Americas revolutionized diets in Europe and China.
And horses and cattle revolutionized life in the Americas.
And tragically, diseases move west, and enslaved people are forcibly moved west across the Atlantic. It's an exchange, but it is not an equal one.
And the model that Portugal and Spain created, state-sponsored exploration, military force to control trade, and colonial extraction, that becomes the blueprint for everyone else.
It becomes the playbook. The Dutch, the English, the French, they all jump in and try to copy and improve on the Iberian model.
So the defining feature of this era isn't that Europe invented everything. It's that it aggressively combined global knowledge with its own unique competitive drive to master the oceans.
And in doing so, they created a whole new world economy.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you to chew on. We've just seen how American silver completely changed the game, shifting the center of economic gravity from the old land-based routes to these new ocean highways. So what happens now to those powerful land empires we talked about at the beginning, the Ottomans, the Mughals in India? How do they react when they realize the world's wealth is no longer flowing past their doorstep, but is now sailing around them?
That's a great question. Because their response to that challenge really defines the next couple of centuries of world history.
We'll see you on the next Deep Dive.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling one of history's most profound and destructive forces, the birth of the Atlantic world.
That's a huge topic.
It is. Our mission is to take that period between, say, 1450 and 1750 and go way beyond just the first voyages in contact. We want to understand the truly global transformation that happened.
Right, when the movement of people, plants, animals, microbes, it all becomes routine. Relentless, even.
Exactly. We're looking at what happens when two totally separate biological hemispheres, collide and then fuse together permanently.
And that's the key idea. This isn't just about trade. It's a full-blown environmental revolution that directly shapes the human story. The term for it, which a lot of you will know, is the Columbian Exchange.
Coined by historian Alfred Crosby.
Yeah, and he described it as a massive, ongoing transfer of species. It created this mixed biological system that had been totally distinct for thousands of years.
And that biological foundation, the diseases, the new foods, that sets the stage for everything else, right? Because we have to connect those environmental changes to the social and economic ones.
Absolutely. Especially the rise of the brutal Atlantic slave system.
So how does that connection work?
Well, if you want to understand why colonial powers shifted to relying almost entirely on enslaved African labor, you have to start with the biology. You've got American crops fueling population growth in Afro-Eurasia.
Okay.
And at the same time, Old World diseases are causing a demographic collapse in the Americas. It creates this huge labor vacuum.
A vacuum that plantation agriculture and forced migration were designed to fill?
Precisely. It's a single, chillingly efficient system.
Okay, so let's unpack that biological shockwave. Let's start with what the Old World Afro-Eurasia brought to the Americas. These things fundamentally altered everything.
The first Europeans were basically walking, talking ecosystems. Let's start with the animal invasion. Before 1492, the Americas had almost none of the big domesticated animals that were common everywhere else. So no horses, no cattle, no pigs, sheep, or goats.
And the impact of just the horse is astonishing. It spreads way beyond Spanish control and completely transforms indigenous societies on the Great Plains.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Groups like the Comanche, suddenly they can hunt buffalo way more efficiently. They have power, mobility. Their whole world shifts. It's a massive technology transfer.
And that's sort of the, I guess, positive adaptation side of it.
It is, but on the destructive side, you have pigs. Pigs were an environmental disaster for indigenous farmers.
Oh, so?
They just reproduced so quickly, and they were often allowed to roam free. They would just tear through indigenous fields. At the same time, you've got these huge herds of cattle and sheep compacting the soil, overgrazing. It was a hostile environmental takeover.
And then there were the crops. They brought things like wheat, of course. But the really critical one, the one that drives centuries of global history, is sugarcane.
Sugarcane. originally from Southeast Asia, but it found the perfect home in the Caribbean and Brazil. The climate, the soil, everything was ideal.
But it's a brutal crop to grow.
Unforgiving. It requires this continuous intensive labor, planting, weeding, and then this mad dash to crush and boil the cane before it spoils. That biological need for extreme year-round labor is the direct economic spark for the scale of the Atlantic slave trade.
But even more immediate, even more profound, were the unseen invaders, the pathogens.
Yeah, smallpox, measles, influenza. We all know they devastated populations that had no immunity.
But what's the really surprising thing the sources point out about how they spread?
It's the speed. These diseases often traveled ahead of the Europeans themselves.
So they weren't waiting for direct contact.
Not at all. They moved along existing indigenous trade routes, sometimes showing up years before a single European ship. And the mortality rates were just astronomical. We're talking up to 90% of local populations in some areas.
Which is more than just a human tragedy. It's chaos.
It's total chaos. It weakens political systems, it dissolves communities, and it, of course, creates that massive labor shortage we keep coming back to.
Okay, let's flip it. While the Americas are collapsing, New World crops are fundamentally changing the diet and supporting population growth across the Old World.
Yeah, this is the other side of the exchange. You've got maize, corn, potatoes, sweet potatoes, cassava, and also things we take for granted now, like tomatoes and cacao.
And these were calorie powerhouses.
Fundamentally superior in terms of calories per acre compared to a lot of Old World grains.
The potato is a perfect example, isn't it? It thrives in cool climates, poor soil. It just took off in places like Ireland.
And it fueled huge population growth there and all across Northern Europe. Or look at China. China's population explodes in this era, partly because maize and sweet potatoes allowed farmers to cultivate hilly, marginal lands where you just couldn't grow rice.
So it expands the amount of farmable land.
Dramatically.
Yeah.
And in Africa, you have cassava. It's this hardy root crop, it's drought-resistant, and it becomes a vital, calorie-dense food source. It helps some populations weather both climate shifts and, the depopulation from the slave trade itself.
So you have this profound contrast. American crops are feeding millions and supporting population booms across Afro-Eurasia.
While the Americas, the origin point for those crops, is experiencing a demographic collapse unlike anything in human history.
That contrast brings us to the environmental reshaping of the Americas, the actual physical collision between two different ways of using the land.
Right, it was a clash of paradigms.
What does that clash look like on the ground?
Well, you had indigenous land use that often involved really sophisticated techniques, things like controlled burning to manage forests or mixed farming. European agriculture was totally different. It was driven by cash crops and their livestock. So they introduced the fenced field, the plow, monocropping.
Which means clearing forests.
Massive amounts of forest, especially for sugar and tobacco plantations. And the consequences were immediate. You get rapid soil erosion from that deforestation and from the cattle compacting the soil. The whole ecological balance is just destabilized instantly.
And it's not just the big things, right? There are smaller invaders, too.
Oh, yeah. European weeds, which were harmless in Eurasia, just choked out native plants in the Americas. And the rats. Rats were on every single ship. They spread inland from port cities, carrying disease and becoming just another agricultural pest. The land itself was being colonized.
Turned into an engine for profit.
Exactly. And all this environmental instability just underscores the human tragedy. That demographic split, collapse in one hemisphere, growth in the other, is the absolute pivot point for the entire Atlantic system.
Because that massive, desperate labor vacuum had to be filled if they wanted to profit from sugar, tobacco, silver.
They had to fill it. And that need, set against this backdrop of a re-engineered, depopulated land, takes us straight to the engine of exploitation.
The Atlantic slave trade.
Which was historically unique. I mean, slavery has existed for millennia, but this system was different.
Different how?
Because of its unbelievable scale, its explicit racialization linking slavery almost exclusively to people of African descent, and its deep connection to capitalist plantation agriculture for a global market.
And how was the trade organized? Europeans weren't marching deep into the African interior to capture people, were they?
No, that's a crucial point. For the most part, they couldn't. They were constrained by tropical diseases, by the geography, so they relied heavily on African intermediaries.
So African kings, merchants.
Warlords, yeah. They established these coastal trading forts and worked with powerful African groups who would conduct raids inland, capture people, and then sell them to the Europeans.
In exchange for what?
manufactured goods, textiles, and critically, firearms, which of course just fueled more conflict and more capturing. It was a horrific business transaction.
And the journey itself, the Middle Passage.
Was just institutionalized cruelty. I mean, you have to imagine it. Weeks, sometimes months, packed shoulder to shoulder, chained below deck, disease, abuse, filth. Mortality rates were often over 15%.
And this wasn't an accident. It was a designed part of the system.
It was the intentional mechanism designed to transplant human labor and keep the supply lines for the global commodity market flowing.
Which brings us to that classic model we all learn about, the triangular trade.
Which is really just a cycle of exploitation. It starts with manufactured goods from Europe going to Africa.
Okay.
Then, enslaved people are shipped across the Middle Passage to the Americas. And finally, you have the colonial products, sugar, tobacco, raw cotton, shipped back to Europe for huge profits.
And the whole cycle depends on the plantation system.
That's the core infrastructure. The plantation was basically industrial agriculture before the Industrial Revolution. A huge estate, tightly controlled, focused on one cash crop, sugar being the biggest moneymaker.
And because the labor was so brutal and the conditions so lethal, mortality rates for the enslaved were incredibly high.
Chronically high. The system wasn't designed for the enslaved population to reproduce itself. It was designed for maximum output, which meant planters relied on a continuous, costly stream of new imports from Africa just to maintain their workforce.
And the whole thing is governed by the economic theory of the time, mercantilism.
Right. Mercantilism basically said that wealth is finite. It's a zero-sum game. So European governments wanted to accumulate as much gold and silver as possible.
And the colonies were the key to doing that.
They were essential. The colonies existed for one reason: to provide cheap raw materials to the mother country and to be a closed market for the mother country's finished goods. It's an enforcement system. Laws like Britain's Navigation Acts made sure that all that colonial wealth flowed in one direction.
Back to Europe.
Back to the ruling power. It was the financial scaffolding that justified the whole system of violence.
So when you force people from 3 continents into this high-pressure extractive system, you don't just get commerce, you get entirely new societies.
And those societies are built on deep enforced hierarchies. The colonizers needed a way to justify this massive power imbalance.
Which in Spanish and Portuguese America becomes the casta system.
A really complicated, obsessive way to categorize every single person based on their perceived racial mixing: European, indigenous, and African heritage.
So how did it work?
Well, at the very top, you had the Peninsulares people born in Europe. They held all the real power. Below them, the Creoles people of pure European descent, but born in the Americas.
And then everyone else?
Then all the mixed groups, the mestizos, the mulattoes. And at the very bottom, indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans. These categories rigidly enforced who had power and who didn't.
And yet, despite these brutal attempts at segregation, cultural mixing was just inevitable.
Constant. This is where we see syncretism, the blending of different cultures and beliefs. Despite the power of European culture, African and indigenous peoples were not passive. They found ways to adapt and blend their traditions.
We see that most clearly in religion, don't we? Which often becomes a kind of subtle resistance.
Absolutely. In places like the Caribbean and Brazil, African religious practices blended with Catholic elements. You get new traditions like voodoo or candomblé, where Catholic saints were often secretly identified with African deities.
So it's a way of preserving identity.
A vital source of comfort, identity, and shared meaning in the face of just unbelievable brutality.
We also have to talk about the roles of women. European patriarchal ideals dominated, of course, but women were essential to these new societies.
They were. Enslaved women, especially, played these dual economic roles, punishing work in the fields and then domestic labor, all while facing extreme violence and exploitation. The system was designed to break families apart.
But they resisted.
They resisted, constantly. By forming complex kin networks, by creating families despite the constant threat of being sold and separated, those social bonds were the main form of cultural and psychological survival.
So this whole deep dive, it really shows us that the Atlantic world was a tightly wound clock. By 1750, you have European demand for sugar-driving production in the colonies, which then demands more and more African labor. You pull one thread and the whole system responds.
It's completely interconnected. And it established global trade networks in a permanent industrial way. It's crucial to see that the wealth, the capital, and the extractive economies generated during this period of immense violence, it didn't just vanish in 1750.
So here's the final thought for you to consider. This foundation of wealth capital generated by the brutal plantation complex and mercantilist control. It provided the critical resources, the infrastructure, and the knowledge that would lay the groundwork for later eras of European advancement.
So when you study later developments like the Industrial Revolution or the Enlightenment, you have to ask yourself, how much of that progress was ultimately financed and founded upon the coerced labor and the biological mixing that defined the Atlantic world? The world we live in today still stands on these complex, deeply troubled foundations. Welcome back to the Deep Dive.
Yeah.
So when you think about the world between, say, 1450 and 1750, your mind probably goes straight to the oceans. You're picturing ships, exploration, the whole Atlantic system kicking off.
And that's a huge part of the story, of course. But today, we want to correct that map a little. Our mission for this deep dive is to pull the focus back onto the landmass of Eurasia.
Because something else massive was happening at the exact same time.
Exactly. The rise of these enormous, powerful, centralized land-based states. We're talking about empires that, for most of this period, controlled the majority of the planet's population and, frankly, its wealth.
Right, the so-called gunpowder empires. Now, that name itself is interesting. It makes it sound like it's all about technology. You know, we have cannons, you don't, so we win. But it has to be more complex than that.
Oh, absolutely. That's probably the biggest misconception. The term gunpowder empires, and we're mainly talking about the Ottomans, the Safavids, the Mughals, it isn't just about them having firearms. It's about them having this organizational genius to pay for them, to deploy them in a professional army, and to build a whole state structure around this new military revolution. The cannon was the tool, sure, but centralization was the real engine.
So if we look past the tech, what are the common threads? What are those universal characteristics that define all these new regimes?
Well, they all needed a few key things. First, huge professional armies that were loyal directly to the ruler, not to some local lord. Second, you need a bureaucracy, a growing, complex one, to actually run the territory and collect taxes.
Which means you need reliable money coming in.
Precisely, usually from taxing agriculture or controlling trade routes. And finally, they all used a combination of monumental architecture and religion to prove they had the right to rule, to build that legitimacy.
So why is it so important for us to get this part of the story right?
Because if you only look at the maritime empires, the European ones, you end up with a really incomplete and frankly a very Eurocentric view of how power worked. These Eurasian empires were often richer, bigger, and for a long time militarily stronger than their European rivals.
They provide a totally different model for how to build a state.
And crucially, how to govern incredibly diverse populations. That's a lesson that's still relevant.
Okay, so let's dig into that. Let's start with the big one, the model everyone was sort of measured against, the Ottoman Empire.
The Ottomans started out really small, just one of many Turkic groups in Anatolia, but their location was everything. They were sitting at the ultimate crossroads.
Between Europe and Asia?
And Africa, too.
Yeah.
It gave them almost unlimited access to trade and, endless military opportunities. They could push in any direction.
And then comes the moment that just changes the world map forever. 1453, Mehmed Suketin takes Constantinople.
That moment was absolutely seismic. I mean, symbolically, it's the final nail in the coffin for the Byzantine Empire, which had lasted 1,000 years.
But practically?
Practically, it gave them control of Istanbul, one of the greatest cities on Earth, and the key choke point connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. It cemented their control over a 3-continent empire.
The sources really stress that their military genius wasn't just about cannons pointed outward, but about how they organized inward. Let's talk about the Janissaries.
Right, the elite infantry. The question for any sultan was, how do you create a professional army that is 100% loyal to you and only you?
Especially when they're recruited from all over the empire.
Their solution was the devshirme system. It was a systematic levy. Christian boys from families in the Balkans were taken, converted to Islam, and then put through this incredibly rigorous training.
And they could end up in the army or the government.
Exactly. The best of the best became janissaries, the elite soldiers. Others would become high-ranking administrators.
That system just sounds so brutal for the families involved.
Right.
I mean, how did the Sultan justify that?
Well, from the Sultan's perspective, the political logic was just undeniable. This process completely severed the boy's ties to his home, to his family, to any local noble. His entire life, his status, his wealth, it all came directly from the Sultan.
So there's no question where his loyalty lies.
None whatsoever. It was a revolutionary way to bypass the old, entrenched aristocracies and centralized power.
So they built this incredibly loyal military machine.
Mm-hmm.
But they're ruling over, as you said, Greeks, Armenians, Slavs, Jews. How did they manage that level of diversity without it just turning into constant chaos?
They developed something called the millet system. It was actually quite
A
ingenious.
millet system.
Yeah. Essentially, non-Muslim communities were organized into these legally recognized autonomous groups. So if you were Greek Orthodox, for instance, your community handled its own affairs, marriage, education, local legal disputes.
So long as they paid their taxes.
So long as they paid their taxes and accepted the sultan's overall authority, it was pragmatic. It prioritized stability over trying to force everyone to be the same.
Okay, so if the Ottoman solution was this kind of pragmatic, decentralized tolerance, what about their biggest rival, the Safavid Empire? How did they build their state identity?
The Safavids, over in Persia, went in the complete opposite direction. They decided to use religion to forge a single, unified identity.
How so?
Under their founder, Shah Ismail I, they adopted Twelver Shia Islam as the official and mandatory state religion.
Which immediately put them at odds with the Ottomans.
Who were Sunni exactly? This one decision created a political and sectarian rivalry that would define the Middle East for centuries to come.
And we see that rivalry play out on the battlefield for sure. But the Safavids also projected their power through just massive cultural displays, especially in their capital, Isfahan.
Isfahan, especially under Shah Abbas I, was designed to be a spectacle of power. I mean, the main public square was so big they could play polo matches in it. It was a statement.
A statement of wealth and confidence.
Completely. The grand mosques, the palaces, and of course their world-famous production of carpets and silks. It all projected this image of divine favor and commercial might.
Let's shift east now to the Indian subcontinent and the Mughal Empire. This is a totally unique setup. A Muslim ruling class governing a massive, overwhelmingly Hindu population.
Right. And like the others, gunpowder helped them conquer the territory. But the central problem for the Mughals was always revenue. How do you pay for these enormous armies and these incredible building projects like, the Taj Mahal? Where does that money come from?
It had to come from the land.
It all came from the land. The primary source of income was land revenue, and they collected it through a brilliant innovation, the zamindars.
And who were they?
They were local landholders or officials. Their job was to collect taxes from the peasants in their area. They'd keep a cut for themselves and then pass the rest up to the imperial government.
So it extends the empire's reach without having to put a government official in every single village.
Exactly. It was a system of intermediaries that made administering a vast agricultural empire possible.
Now we get to what seems to be the critical turning point for the Mughals. This huge contrast in religious policy between two rulers, Akbar and Aurangzeb.
This is such a crucial story. So you have Akbar ruling in the late 1500s. He pursues this policy of, radical accommodation. He gets rid of the jizya, the tax on non-Muslims. He hosts debates between different faiths.
And he brings Hindus into the highest levels of his government.
He does. And this policy of tolerance, it really worked. It stabilized the empire and got buy-in from the majority population while the empire was still growing.
But then, a few generations later, his great-grandson Aurangzeb completely flips the script.
Completely. In the late 17th century, Aurangzeb brings back the jizya. He pursues much more orthodox, explicitly Islamic policies. And this wasn't just a religious move, it was political dynamite.
Because it alienated huge parts of the population.
It led to massive internal conflicts, especially with rising powers like the Marathas. It fundamentally weakened the empire from within and really set the stage for its eventual decline. The contrast is it's a perfect lesson in how religious policy and imperial stability are linked.
So moving beyond those core three, we see similar things happening on the fringes. Russia, East Asia. This model of land-based consolidation was a truly global thing during this period.
Without a doubt. You look at Russia, which starts with Moscow finally shaking off Mongol rule. They then begin this relentless expansion eastward, conquering Siberia and the Tatar Khanates.
Using gunpowder, just like the others.
Right, but their internal fight was just as important, consolidating power against their own nobility, the boyars.
And unlike the Ottomans creating a new loyal class with the Janissaries, the Russian state found its economic engine by making an old system even more brutal, serfdom.
That's the key. The whole system was built on the backs of serfs. Peasants were increasingly tied to the land. They owed labor. They could be bought and sold with the land they worked. This massive system of coerced labor funded Russia's military expansion.
And then Peter the Great comes along and decides Russia needs a shock to the system.
a massive shock. He kicks off his famous westernization campaign. It's often brutal, but it's effective. He reorganizes the army, builds a navy, and most symbolically, he founds a new capital, St. Petersburg, on the Baltic Sea.
A window to the west.
Exactly. It was a clear political statement that Russia was now a player in European diplomacy and technology, whether the old boyars liked it or not.
Meanwhile, all the way over in East Asia, the Manchu-led Qing dynasty takes over China and expands the empire's borders into places like Tibet and Mongolia.
And what's so fascinating about the Qing is their use of continuity. Even though they were foreign invaders, the Manchus immediately adopted traditional Chinese methods of rule.
Like the Confucian civil service exams.
Most importantly, it was a genius move. It legitimized their rule and gave them the tools to manage this incredibly sophisticated bureaucracy that was already in place.
And the Qing showed their centralized power not just by expanding, but by tightly controlling who they interacted with through the Canton system.
Right. They weren't isolationists, not really, but they were absolutely in control. They restricted most European trade to a single port, Canton. It showed that they, not the Europeans, were setting the terms of engagement.
And for our final example, speaking of internal focus, Tokugawa Japan probably takes the most extreme path to centralization.
Yeah, after a century of civil war, the Tokugawa shogunate was obsessed with one thing: stability. And they had an ingenious way of controlling their regional lords, the daimyo,
The alternate attendance system.
or Senkenkotai. The daimyo had to spend every other year in the capital, Edo. And this is the crucial part, they had to leave their families in Edo permanently.
That's hostages.
Basically, yes. It was an incredibly effective way to ensure loyalty and prevent rebellion without having to fight constant wars.
And that focus on internal stability is what leads them to suppress Christianity and limit foreign contact through the Sakoku policy.
Exactly. So if we zoom out and put all these pieces together, you can really see these two major models of power operating in the world at this time.
You have the land empires we've been talking about, and then the maritime empires building their power overseas.
And a key difference is where the money comes from. The land empires, the Ottomans, Mughals, Qing, they're all funded overwhelmingly by agricultural taxes. Systems like the zamindars, or just controlling overland trade routes.
Whereas the maritime empires are pulling their wealth from overseas trade, from silver mine in the Americas, from plantation goods. It's a totally different economic base.
And that funds a totally different kind of state with a different kind of military.
Which brings us back to that really important comparative point: managing diversity. We've basically seen three distinct answers to that problem.
We really have. You've got the Ottoman millet system, decentralized autonomy for taxes and loyalty. You have the Safavid model, using a mandatory state religion, Shi'ism, to create a uniform identity.
And then the Mughals, who show both sides of the coin.
Right. They swing from Akbar's radical tolerance to Aurangzeb's strict enforcement, and you see how fragile an empire can be when that policy changes.
So the big takeaway here is that you just can't understand the early modern world if you don't master these land-based states. They were the dominant political force across Eurasia, controlling the flow of everything.
And that brings us to a final provocative thought for you. We've focused on the land-based power of these empires, but our sources constantly remind us that all of them, the Ottomans in the Mediterranean, the Mughals in the Indian Ocean, the Qing in East Asia, they all had to constantly engage with, regulate, or fight against the growing maritime trade networks.
So even these massive land empires couldn't ignore the sea. What does it suggest about the future, about the long-term stability of a land empire, when the world's wealth is slowly shifting to the oceans? What happens when you can't control your own coastlines or your key connections to global trade? That question really defines the transition to the next historical period. Welcome back to the deep dive. So if you've been following our journey through the early modern world, that's period 2, roughly 1350 to 1750, we've spent a lot of time on the big picture stuff.
Right. The exploration, the Columbian Exchange, those massive gunpowder empires.
Exactly. We've covered the economy, the trade, the conflict, the whole guns, germs, and silver side of the story.
And while all of that is, absolutely foundational, today we're going a bit deeper. We're really drilling down into the intellectual and the cultural transformations that define this whole era.
Yeah, because the early modern world wasn't just shaped by new trade routes. It was fundamentally remade by, well, books, sermons, experiments, and philosophical arguments.
That's a great way to put it.
So our mission today is to figure out how these new, really revolutionary ideas started to challenge the old authorities. We're talking about the church, the classical scholars that everyone had trusted for centuries.
And crucially, what these shifts meant for how rulers legitimized their power, and even how people started to think about human difference on a global scale. This is sort of the blueprint for the modern mind being drawn up.
And you really can't understand what comes next without this piece.
You absolutely can't. I mean, the intellectual chain reaction we're about to trace, it feeds directly into the huge political revolutions of the late 18th century. When you hear about things like natural rights or limited government, the roots are right here.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning of this transformation. Let's talk about the rebirth, the Renaissance. It kicks off in the Italian city-states, 14th, 15th centuries.
And it's all fueled by this renewed, almost obsessive fascination with classical Greek and Roman texts, art, ideas, all of it.
And the intellectual engine driving this was humanism.
Right. And we have to be really clear about what humanism meant then. It wasn't atheism or anything like that. Most humanists were deeply religious people. It was about focusing on the studia humanitatis.
Which are what exactly?
Think of it as the liberal arts. Grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, moral philosophy. Subjects designed not just to train priests, but to create, active and effective citizens, people who could contribute to society here on Earth.
So how did they square that with a worldview that was so focused on eternal salvation? I mean, wasn't that a conflict?
That's the key question. It wasn't really about rejection, it was about a shift in emphasis. Humanism turned the spotlight onto the potential of human beings in this world.
Ah, okay.
The new focus was on individual achievement, on developing your talents, using classical virtue as a model, instead of just seeing life as a waiting room for the afterlife.
And you can literally see this mindset taking shape in the art. I mean, that's what makes it so memorable.
Oh, absolutely. Artists weren't just painting saints anymore. They're studying human anatomy to make their figures look real, lifelike. They were experimenting with linear perspective.
That trick that makes a flat painting like three-dimensional, right? Like you can walk right into it.
Exactly. Capturing the world as the eye actually sees it. It was a celebration of human skill. And of course, all this required some serious funding.
Which is where patrons like the Medici family in Florence come in.
Right. They and other wealthy families understood that sponsoring these artists and scholars was a fantastic way to boost their own prestige. It was a power move.
Okay, but these incredible ideas, whether in art or philosophy, they were just stayed in a few Italian cities without a way to spread. They needed a technological accelerant.
And they got one. The printing press, with movable type, developed in Europe around the mid-15th century, most famously by Gutenberg.
Now, printing itself wasn't new, was it?
No, not at all. It had existed for centuries in East Asia. But the European adaptation for alphabetic scripts, it just dramatically increased the speed and, crucially, cut the cost of making books. It was a complete game changer.
So this just flooded Europe with information. Classical texts, scientific papers, political pamphlets.
Everything. But what's really fascinating is how it supercharged the rise of vernacular languages.
The everyday languages people actually spoke, like German or French or English, not Latin.
Exactly. And this was especially explosive when it came to religious texts.
Because if you print the Bible in German, suddenly anyone who can read German has direct access to Scripture. They don't need a priest to translate and interpret it for them. How did the church react to that? I mean, that's a direct threat to their entire authority structure.
It was an immense threat. And you've put your finger on the essential setup for the Reformation. For 1,000 years, the clergy had a monopoly on interpretation because Scripture was in Latin.
And suddenly that monopoly is just shattered.
It's shattered. The church tried to fight back, of course. They censored books, prosecuted people for heresy. But you can't put the genie back in the bottle. The ideas were spreading too fast.
Which brings us right to that massive fracture in European history, the Protestant Reformation. It's not just some theological debate. It's a full-blown socio-political earthquake.
And you can really trace it to three big forces all hitting at once.
Okay, so first you have the religious grievances. People saw corruption in the church, the hierarchy felt distant, and then there's the whole business of selling indulgences.
The idea that you could pay money to reduce your time in purgatory, it felt very transactional, and a lot of people were deeply troubled by it.
And second, you have that intellectual stimulus we just talked about.
Right. The humanists. They're going back to the earliest Christian texts, and they're noticing, some pretty big differences between the Bible and what the church was actually doing.
And third, the cold, hard politics of it all.
The political and economic motives. Rulers all over Europe are looking at the church and thinking, wait a minute, They have immense power, vast amounts of land, and they're sending a ton of money from my territory to Rome.
It was an opportunity.
A massive one. And Martin Luther lit the match in 1517. His core challenge was built on two really powerful ideas. Salvation comes from faith alone, not good works, and the ultimate authority is the scripture itself, not church tradition or the Pope.
And thanks to the printing press, his writings went viral.
They did. And with the political backing of German princes who wanted to break from Rome, Lutheranism actually survived and established itself.
But Luther was just the first domino, wasn't he? The movement splintered almost immediately.
Very quickly. You get figures like John Calvin in Geneva. His theology is centered on the absolute sovereignty of God. And this is the big one, the idea of predestination.
The idea that God has already decided who's going to be saved and who isn't before you're even born.
Yes. And it sounds grim, but it had this paradoxical effect. Calvinists believed that working hard and living a moral life might be a sign that you were one of the chosen, which encouraged this incredible discipline. It spread to France, the Huguenots, and to Scotland.
And then you have England, which is a totally different story.
A completely political break. King Henry VIII needs a male heir. The Pope won't grant him an annulment, so he just breaks away. The Act of Supremacy in 1534 makes the king the head of the new Church of England. Done.
So with all these different movements breaking away, the Catholic Church couldn't have just stood by and watched.
No, they were not passive at all. They launched a vigorous response, what we call the Catholic Reformation or the Counter-Reformation.
That were their main strategies. They couldn't just condemn everyone, could they?
They had to reform from within. They held the Council of Trent, which met off and on for almost 20 years, and there they did two things. They reaffirmed core Catholic teachings, like the importance of both faith and works, but they also cleaned house. They condemned abuses, banned the sale of indulgences, and demanded better discipline from their clergy.
And they also created a new tool, a new kind of religious order.
The ultimate shock troops, the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus. Founded by Ignatius of Loyola, they were incredibly educated, highly disciplined, and they became the church's most effective agents.
Not just in Europe, right?
Not at all. They were global. They led aggressive missionary work in the Americas and Asia and Africa, often using education and cultural adaptation as their main tools.
When you connect all these deep, sincere religious differences to the political map of Europe, things get violent. Fast.
Devastatingly violent. You see conflicts like the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in France in 1572, where thousands of Huguenots were just slaughtered.
But the conflict that really defines this whole era, the one that shows the true destructive power of these wars, is the 30 Years' War.
From 1618 to 1648. It starts as a religious fight in the Holy Roman Empire, but it just spirals out of control into this massive geopolitical struggle. Almost every major power gets dragged in.
And the devastation, especially in the German lands where most of it was fought, is just, it's hard to comprehend.
It is. Some estimates suggest certain German regions lost half their population. It was a catastrophe.
So what finally brought it to an end? What changed?
The game changer is the treaty that ended it. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648. This is a critical so what moment in history. It basically established the principle of state sovereignty.
Meaning rulers could now choose the official religion of their own territory without some outside power like the Pope or the Holy Roman Emperor telling them what to do.
Exactly. It marks this decisive shift toward a more secular, state-centered order in Europe. Political interests start to officially matter more than religious unity.
And I imagine after 30 years of chaos, rulers were desperate for stability.
Desperate. And that devastation directly fueled state building. Rulers realized they needed stronger central governments, professional armies, better bureaucracies to prevent that kind of collapse from happening again. This is where you see the drive toward absolutism, like with Louis XIV in France, really take off.
It's amazing. It seems like the chaos of the religious wars is what pushed people to look for a different kind of certainty. A different kind of truth.
That's a perfect way to put it. After decades of bloodshed over whose interpretation of God's word was right, thinkers started looking for universal truths, things that could be verified that weren't dependent on faith.
And that leads us straight to the scientific revolution.
Right. Spanning the 16th through 18th centuries, the core shift here is profound. Scholars started relying less on ancient texts from people like Aristotle and more on observation, experimentation, and mathematical reasoning.
And right away, they start with the biggest subject there is, the universe.
They flip it upside down. Copernicus comes along and proposes the heliocentric model. The sun is at the center, not the earth. And you have to understand, this wasn't just a science thing. It challenged centuries of philosophy and theology that put humanity at the very center of God's creation.
And then Galileo builds on that, using his telescope to make observations that support Copernicus. And his famous conflict with the Catholic Inquisition just shows how high the stakes were.
It does. He was forced to recant. But the evidence was mounting. And the giant who ties it all together is, of course, Isaac Newton.
Right, with the laws of motion and universal gravitation.
He creates the mathematical framework that explains how the whole system works, from an apple falling from a tree to the planets orbiting the sun. It's all one coherent, predictable system.
But it's not just the discoveries themselves. It was the method, wasn't it?
The method was everything. The emphasis on empirical observation, what can you see and test, and then applying rigorous math to explain it.
And this wasn't just a few isolated geniuses. They built institutions around this new method.
Totally. You see the founding of groups like the Royal Society in England or the French Academy of Sciences. These places were created to support research, to publish findings, and to create a kind of pan-European republic of letters, where scholars could debate and share their work.
So what was the relationship between this new science and religion? Was it just all-out war?
It's more nuanced than that. I mean, most of these early scientists were deeply religious men. They saw their work as uncovering the rational, elegant order of God's creation.
So they weren't trying to disprove God.
Not at all. They were trying to understand his design. The conflict arose when a specific scientific finding, like the Earth moving, contradicted a very literal interpretation of Scripture that had been locked in as official doctrine.
Okay, so the success of these scientific methods, this idea of using reason and evidence to understand the natural world, it was just too powerful to stay contained in science.
Absolutely. The next logical step was inevitable. Thinkers started to say, hey, if this works for planets and gravity, why can't we apply the same rational thinking to society, politics, and human behavior?
And that is the heart of the Enlightenment.
That's it. Enlightenment thinkers treasured reason and critical inquiry. They used logic and often biting satire to attack superstition, dogma, and the arbitrary rule of kings who claimed power simply from God.
This is where we get the bedrock of modern political philosophy, right? The social contract theories.
Yes, and it's fascinating to contrast the two big ones. First, you have Thomas Hobbes. He lived through the English Civil War, saw total chaos, and argued that humans in a state of nature are basically violent and selfish.
So for him, the solution is to surrender all your freedom to an absolute ruler, a leviathan, in exchange for safety and order.
Exactly. A bleak, but for him, logical trade-off. But then, not long after, you get John Locke, who completely changes the conversation.
Locke is all about natural rights.
Life, liberty, and property. And crucially, he argues these rights come from God or nature, not from a king. He says that governments are only created to protect those rights.
And if they don't?
And here's the world-changing part. If a government fails to protect those rights, or worse, actively violates them, the people have the right to alter or abolish it.
How radical was an idea like that at the time? I mean, the default was still the divine right of kings, that a monarch's power came straight from God.
It was incredibly radical. It completely flips the source of legitimacy. Power no longer comes down from heaven to the king. It comes up from the people. The government's power is now conditional, based on the consent of the governed.
And that idea is the philosophical dynamite that sets off the American and French revolutions a century later.
It's the mechanism that justifies revolution. And these ideas didn't just stay in academic books. They spread through the public sphere.
Coffee houses, salons, reading clubs.
Places where educated people, and not just the top elites, could gather to debate these new books and ideas. It created an informed public that was ready to start demanding their rights.
And after centuries of religious warfare, tolerance also became a key theme.
A huge theme. Thinkers like Voltaire argued fiercely for freedom of conscience, for separating religious authority from political authority. To them, it wasn't just a moral good, it was a practical necessity for a stable society.
Now we have to remember, these ideas didn't just stay cooped up in Europe. This was an age of global exchange.
And the Jesuits, those missionary shock troops we mentioned, were a key part of that.
How so?
Well, they carried European science, astronomy, clockmaking, map-making to places like the imperial court in China. They engaged with Confucian scholars, helped them correct the official calendar. It was an export of European practical knowledge.
But the information flowed both ways, right? It wasn't a one-way street.
Not at all. And this is so important. Missionaries and travelers sent back detailed accounts of other societies. For instance, European thinkers became fascinated by reports of China's merit-based civil service exam system.
An alternative to just inheriting your power and position like a European aristocrat.
Precisely. It fueled their arguments for a more rational system of governance. But, and this is a crucial caveat, we can't let this story become just about Europe.
Right. While all this was happening in Europe, other civilizations had their own vibrant intellectual traditions running in parallel.
Exactly. In China, for example, Neo-Confucianism provided a deeply sophisticated ethical and political framework for the entire imperial state. In the Islamic world, scholars in the Ottoman and Safavid empires continued their deep traditions in law, theology, and science.
And in South Asia, you had this incredibly complex interaction of Hindu, Muslim, and Sikh thinkers.
So you have to see the European developments as just one part of a much larger, diverse, global intellectual landscape that was flourishing at the same time.
So let's tie this all together for you, our listener. We've really traced this incredible chain reaction. The technology of the printing press sparked the cultural change of the Reformation,
Which led to political change with the Peace of Westphalia and the rise of the modern state.
which in turn inspired new ways of knowing in the scientific revolution.
Which finally gave birth to the foundational political ideas of the Enlightenment, like natural rights and government by consent.
It's really the origin story for so many of the ideas we take for granted today: constitutional law, the right to dissent, the value of evidence. The roots are all right here.
They absolutely are. It's the foundation course for the modern world.
So as you think about this huge transformation, here's a final thought for you to consider. Think about how those powerful non-European societies, the Ottoman Empire, Qing China, Tokugawa Japan, how did they manage the balance between their own powerful inherited traditions and the new pressures and ideas emerging during these same centuries? What stands out to you about how different civilizations navigated that delicate balance between inherited wisdom and radical new ideas? Welcome to the Deep Dive. We are cracking open a massive stack of sources today.
A big one.
A very big one, yeah. All focused on the era from 1450 to 1750. And this isn't just, dry history about exploration.
Oh, yeah.
This is that 300-year window where the building blocks of the modern, truly global economic system were forged. So our mission today is a serious one. We want to synthesize how goods, people, and ideas circulated between continents in ways that were, frankly, unimaginable before this. We're trying to move beyond that simple, kind of linear narrative of a European takeover to explore the complex, messy, and often brutal web of interactions that define this early modern world.
That's exactly right. The early modern world it's foundational. I mean, if you want to understand modern geopolitical inequality, global supply chains, or even the roots of industrial labor, you have to start here.
Right.
So we'll be zeroing in on three core areas: the financial innovations that powered these new maritime powers, the specific commodities that, tied the world together, and the profound social and cultural shifts that came along for the ride.
Okay, let's unpack this enormous shift in global power. I mean, Spain and Portugal, they really set the initial patterns in the 16th century, right, with their American conquests and their trading posts in Africa and Asia.
They did. But by the 17th century, the competition heats up dramatically. And the geographic center of commercial power, it moves north.
In northwestern Europe.
Precisely. We're talking about the rise of the Dutch Republic, England and France. And these weren't just bigger or tougher ships. They had these deep structural advantages that let them challenge Iberian dominance both commercially and militarily.
So strong navies, sure. But you're saying the real edge was something else.
Yes. The truly revolutionary competitive edge was financial and organizational.
And here's where it gets really interesting for you, the listener. We're talking about the joint stock companies, which is really the organizational blueprint for what we now call the multinational corporation, but fused with state authority.
The prime example, and you could argue it's the most important non-state entity of the whole era, is the Dutch East India Company, the VOC.
Right, the Verenigd Duitsche Company.
Exactly, chartered in 1602. And what made it so revolutionary wasn't just its size, it was the structure. Before the VOC, if you wanted to finance a big trade voyage, you'd raise money, the ship comes back, you pay everyone, and the company dissolves.
A one-off venture. every single time.
One-off. VOC changed all that. It was the first company to issue transferable stock, meaning people could buy and sell shares of the company itself without having to liquidate the whole operation.
That's a huge innovation.
It's massive. This allowed the VOC to raise permanent, long-term capital on a scale that just gave it this financial resilience that no one else had.
And the government backed this financial power up with real power.
Oh, absolutely. The Dutch state granted the VOC quasi-governmental powers. It wasn't just a business. It could literally raise its own armies and navies. It could wage war, establish forts, and negotiate treaties in Asia on behalf of the Netherlands.
They weren't messing around.
Not at all.
And that authority let them execute their strategy. Seize control of key ports, especially in the Indonesian archipelago, to completely dominate the spice trade. They controlled not just the shipping lanes, but the production sites themselves.
And this template gets copied fast. We see similar strategies, though, with, varying levels of success from the English East India Company, the EIC, and the French East India Company.
And the EIC is a key example of that blurred line between commerce and empire.
A perfect example. It started as a pure trading enterprise, but by the 18th century, the EIC is using its own private military to secure territorial control in India. They went from traders to rulers.
Okay, so let's look at the actual empires these companies and states built. The contrast is really stark between the Atlantic and the Indian Oceans.
It is.
Let's start with the Atlantic. Here, empire building was highly extractive and settler-focused. So in North America, you have the English model, which evolves. In New England, it's mixed agriculture. But you go further south, and the drive is for cash crops like tobacco, leading to a heavy reliance on forced, enslaved labor. And that's so different from the French activity in the St. Lawrence and Mississippi valleys. Their focus was mostly the fur trade. They needed alliances with indigenous groups and saw much, much slower population growth than the English.
But the real economic powerhouse of the Atlantic, the part that drove the entire system, that was the Caribbean sugar engine.
Right.
Islands like Barbados for the English Jamaica and the French colony of Saint-Domingue, they became these massive sugar factories. This system generated utterly enormous wealth for the metropoles, the mother countries back in Europe.
But at a staggering human cost.
Almost unimaginable. This was a new kind of colony, a massive industrial agricultural project that relied entirely on the brutal efficiency of the transatlantic slave trade to bring in
Enslaved African labor.
enslaved African labor. It was a machine.
So if we connect that violence to the broader global picture, say in the Indian Ocean, the whole narrative changes.
Completely.
Long before Europe ever showed up, the Indian Ocean was arguably the center of global commerce. It ran on these vibrant networks that used the predictable monsoon winds.
Exactly. This was a complex, multi-faith zone. You had Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, and other merchants, Indian, Arab, Swahili, Malay, who had these sophisticated systems for centuries. They were exchanging textiles, spices, metals.
So if that system was already so sophisticated, how could the Europeans just walk in and take over?
Well, the short answer is they couldn't. Not initially, and certainly not completely within this time frame.
Okay.
European arrival absolutely changed the balance of sea power. They forced their way in with cannons, but it didn't just erase the existing Asian networks. Asian merchants continued to conduct the vast majority of intra-Asian trade.
So the Europeans were just another player, a very violent player.
In many cases, yes. They became another set of intermediaries who had to sort of fit into an existing flow of goods.
That's a crucial distinction. We often picture total conquest.
And total conquest was rare. It was mostly limited to small islands or strategic coastal points. European influence often stayed confined to their coastal enclaves, their forts and trading centers.
While the inland regions stayed autonomous.
Largely, yes. Powerful Asian states and local rulers in places like Malacca or Bait, they actively navigated this European pressure. They'd play the Portuguese against the Dutch, form alliances, or just resist. Their dominance was partial and negotiated, not automatic.
This leads us perfectly into the commodities that really knitted the continents together. If the Atlantic produced the violence and the wealth, let's talk about the fiscal driver of the entire global system.
Silver.
Silver.
Yeah.
The Spanish-American mines, those legendary sources at Potosi, the mountain that eats men, they called it, and Zacatecas produced just unimaginable quantities of silver. And this wasn't just wealth for Spain.
No, it was the lifeblood of global trade. The silver's journey is the perfect illustration of globalization. You have the Spanish Manila galleons carrying that American silver across the Pacific to the Philippines.
Where it immediately enters East Asian trade networks.
Ah.
But why? Why did it all end up in Asia? Why wasn't it staying in Europe?
It comes down to massive sustained demand in China. Under the Ming and early Qing dynasties, tax payments were increasingly required to be made in silver.
Ah,
So this policy basically acted like a giant financial magnet, just sucking the world's silver supply into Asia in exchange for high-demand Chinese goods like silk, porcelain, and tea.
so if you trace that entire economic chain, it's incredible.
It is, think about it. Indigenous and African labor in brutal American mines was directly fueling the Chinese fiscal system, and at the same time, satisfying European consumer demand for Asian luxury goods.
That is a globally integrated economy, running on coerced labor.
Absolutely.
And all that silver paid for the goods, and those goods fundamentally transformed European life.
Yeah.
This leads to what historians call the consumer revolution. Look at sugar and tobacco. They shift from being these exclusive luxuries for royalty to being, well, consumed by almost everyone.
Right. Suddenly, sugar is sweetening the newly accessible tea, coffee, and chocolate, which were also new imports. This change in daily habit just fuels this exponential demand for plantation agriculture in the Caribbean and Brazil. It's a feedback loop.
The demand for these goods changed the rhythm of society. Drinking tea or coffee with sugar, it became associated with new rituals of leisure, of social status.
And that consumer demand created the justification for the ongoing expansion of the slave system in the Americas.
And we can't forget textiles.
Whoa.
Indian cotton cloth, the calicos, was a major global commodity.
Huge. It was prized worldwide because, at first, European manufacturers just couldn't match the Indian quality, especially the vibrant, color-fast dyes and the speed of production.
So Europe, which was trying to export its own goods, was actually developing this massive trade deficit with Asia because everybody just wanted Indian textiles.
Precisely. And that enormous demand for textiles stimulated these early efforts to develop local manufacturing capacity at home. This fostered the putting out system.
Which we recognize as proto-industrialization.
Exactly. Merchants would put out raw materials like wool or cotton to rural households. Peasants, often women and children, would spin and weave the cloth in their homes, earning money to supplement their farm income.
So it bypasses the guilds in the cities.
Right. It bypassed the rigid control of the urban guilds and mobilized all this cheap rural labor, really setting the stage for the factory system centuries later. It was the first blurring of that line between agricultural and industrial work.
All that silver, all that sugar, all those textiles.
Right.
That enormous global demand raises a terrifying question. How did the world find the massive, relentless supply of human labor required to produce all this?
And it's so easy to talk about global trade in terms of profit margins, but we have to pause and acknowledge the colossal human infrastructure of coercion that made this wealth possible.
Coercion was everywhere.
It was widespread globally, but it manifested in many different forms. In Spanish America, for instance, you see a whole suite of systems. There was the encomienda, that initial grant of indigenous labor, the repartimiento, which required community labor, the brutal Andean Mita labor draft for the silver mines like Potosi,
And later the hacienda system.
and later the hacienda system, with large estates relying on indigenous laborers who were often tied to the land through debt.
But the key, most brutal distinction lies in that Atlantic system plantation slavery in Brazil, the Caribbean, North America.
Absolutely. While all these systems involved exploitation, the Atlantic model was distinctive. And it was because of two factors: its inherently racial dimension and its chattel nature.
Meaning,
Meaning enslavers claimed ownership not just of the labor, but of the workers' actual bodies. They treated them as movable property, as chattel. This system was uniquely dehumanizing, it was hereditary, and it was commercially driven to maximize profit at any human cost.
and this forced labor wasn't just a colonial thing, what was happening back in Eurasia.
We see equally profound systems of coercion there. In the Russian Empire, serfdom expanded significantly. Peasants were tied to the land, subject to the whims of landlords who restricted their movement, often in response to Western European demand for grain.
And in Asia.
Powerful states like the Qing dynasty used corvée labor. That's state-mandated, unpaid labor for public projects like building canals, roads, or fortresses.
So the global labor landscape of this period was this horrifying mosaic. But it is important to note, even with all this coercion, there was still wage labor.
That's vital context, yes. You still had a relatively free peasantry that coexisted and was numerically dominant in large parts of Western Europe and certain regions of Africa and Asia. It wasn't a world of universal slavery, but it was a world where global economics depended on these systems of extreme exploitation.
Let's shift our focus now to the social and cultural ripple effects of all this connection. Starting with the growth of cities. Global trade just fundamentally fueled urbanization.
It really did.
Key European port cities like Amsterdam, London, and Lisbon, they just exploded in size. And so did the colonial hubs. Mexico City, Lima, Boston. These cities weren't just bigger, they were incubators for change.
They absolutely were. These urban centers nurtured new social groups, powerful merchants, bankers, financiers, professionals. These rising classes gained enormous influence and wealth through global commerce.
And that fundamentally challenged the old order.
It did. It challenged the traditional authority of the older feudal aristocracies, whose power was based solely on land ownership.
And culturally, the era seems to be defined by syncretism, this blending of beliefs and practices.
Yes. In the Emeritus, for example, you see this blending of indigenous spiritual practices and African religious elements mixing pretty seamlessly with Christianity. It resulted in new belief systems that were neither purely European nor purely local. It was an act of cultural survival.
And that was happening elsewhere too.
Oh, yeah. At the same time, you have the continued spread of Islam through trade and Sufi networks in the Indian Ocean world, and it consistently blended with local customs as it expanded inland.
And how did this new connected world impact the structures of gender and family?
Well, patriarchy remained overwhelmingly dominant, but women's experiences really varied based on class, location, and the local legal system.
Sure.
So in parts of Western Europe, particularly among the merchant class, a widow might gain substantial legal rights to own property and run a business. In colonial Latin America, elite women sometimes managed large family estates or wielded influence through convents.
But for the vast majority of women, life was immensely difficult.
Profoundly difficult. Enslaved women in the Caribbean and serf women in Russia, they faced what historians often call the double burdens of gender and status. They endured exploitation in the fields, in the mills, in the household. Yet, and this is crucial, these women were essential for cultural transmission, for maintaining fractured family ties, and for actively fueling resistance against these oppressive systems.
So if we step back and summarize the core takeaway for you, the listener, 1450 to 1750 is the moment the world truly connected. This process created new, highly extractive economic systems. It centralized power, both in the great land-based gunpowder empires and the maritime empires we discussed. And it resulted in intense, large-scale, racialized exploitation.
This era is the undisputed foundation for every global issue we face today. From the architecture of global finance, powered by permanent capital and commodity flow, to the geopolitical structures of inequality. Everything springs directly from the economic and labor systems established in this early modern world. It is the necessary origin story of our present.
Indeed. We spent a lot of time discussing the massive change that European maritime empires brought, especially with the creation of the violent Atlantic system. But the source material also highlighted the surprising continuity of the Indian Ocean trade networks.
The resilience of the Asian merchants, yeah.
That continuity raises a fascinating final thought for you to explore on your own. Given that these powerful older systems, specifically the Indian Ocean trade routes, persisted, adapted, and survived the initial shock of European entry, what other powerful, enduring older systems, whether they're political, cultural, or religious, also persisted through the 1450 to 1750 shifts? And how do those forces still shape the structures of the world we live in today?